Esiet sveicināti!
Good afternoon, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear foreign experts, our viewers remotely and over here. My name is Martin Staugels, and I have the pleasure to welcome you to the conference Opportunities for Management of Art and Antiquities Market, hosted by the National Heritage Board. We'll have 2 days of intense work and take an insight into the recent developments on the market and the management of the antiquities and art objects. This is an important conference due to a number of reasons. Because of its participants, this is an international conference. We have local, international art and management experts who will give you an insight into the current developments on the market, regulation, supervision, and today's practices and implications and challenges therein. Also, the coverage of the participants is also very nice. The representation of the participants is very impressive. We have representatives from art galleries, from the antique shops, from auctions, or those who are trading in art according to the legal framework to bring legitimate or legal items onto the market and reduce the potential trade in illicit art objects. Conference has also an anniversary note to it, 50th anniversary of 1975 UNESCO Convention on the Cultural Property, and 25th anniversary of UNIDROIT Convention on Cultural Objects. So this conference, in a way, somehow launches the celebrations or the anniversary of these both conventions that will continue into 2021. However, over these 2 days of conference, we'll look into insight of how all of this operates. We will talk about local and European perspective on the market management, and the second day will mostly focus on market actors, and we will conclude with a panel discussion where both of the camps will come together to talk about the current art market challenges. Would like to also remind our viewers that you have the opportunity to actively participate in our conference. Please use Facebook comments section to post your questions. We'll take your questions and ask them when the time comes. Presentations will be very interesting, full of facts, and will be distributed after the conference in electronic and printed format. So in other words, presentations will be available after the conference. 2 days of very intense work, and we're ready to start. So it's my pleasure to now give the floor over Zoom, as you know, and now happens to Uldis Zariņš, Under Secretary of the Ministry of Culture for the Culture Policy. Mr. Zariņš, the floor is yours. Good afternoon. Greetings to all the participants at the conference and lecturers. Would like to first of all thank the National Heritage Board for organizing this rather prominent conference. I do have to apologize on behalf of Culture Minister Mr. Pultulis for his absence. He was too busy and could not open today's conference and welcome all the participants, and he delegated this task, therefore, to me. I do suppose that there is no need to explain that culture and heritage is the core element of the identity of any nation, and every country therefore nurtures its heritage to preserve it for future generations. Obviously, cultural heritage also does not operate in isolation and does not see any borders. We're living in a globalized world, and Latvia is part of the global trade of culture objects, and we are working with various heritage items, not only from Latvia, but from around the world. And it is very important for us to make sure that the trade in culture or art objects is meeting the legal standards and international practices and applicable laws and requirements therein, and illicit trade in or trafficking of cultural property is something that we cannot tackle alone. These are issues. Trafficking should be combated through coordinated efforts at the global level, going beyond national level, and by ratifying the conventions that establish the legal framework for our efforts of combating illicit trafficking in cultural property and regulating the trade in cultural property is very important. And last year we reached an important milestone when Latvia ratified two key conventions: UNESCO 1975 Convention on the means of prohibiting and preventing the illicit import, export, and transfer of ownership of cultural property that celebrates its 50th anniversary today, and UNIDROIT Convention on the stolen or illegally exported cultural objects is also another notable convention ratified by Latvia last year, and it marks its 25th anniversary this year. So by ratifying these conventions, Latvia has become a full-fledged partner when it comes to implementing the requirements of these conventions in practice. And these conventions also create a basis for cooperation with partners around the world on efficient prevention of the trafficking of cultural property, money laundering, terrorism financing, and proliferation financing. So national framework is just the basis. And Latvians have this famous saying, you know, the devil is in detail. And, you know, Latvian experts will definitely benefit, and those who are responsible for the trade in cultural property will be able to learn from the best global practices. So once again, thank you to the National Heritage Board for giving us the opportunity to meet virtually, to learn from the best. It is absolutely crucial, of course, to make sure that when it comes to international legal standards, we use not only whip, but also use the carrot. We would like to avoid, by all means, a situation where illicit trafficking is the responsibility only of police force or customs authorities or law enforcement agencies. It is very important for the heritage experts and those who are trading in cultural properties or antiquities shops and art dealers comply also with the best global or international practices and comply with legal requirements to avoid making Latvian market a grey market and make sure that we comply with the best international practices and are an equal trusted partner in implementing the norms of these conventions. Thank you. Would like to wish everyone productive 2 days of conference, and I hope that you will take away a lot of inspiration for your future work. Thank you, Mr. Zariņš, the Secretary of the State responsible for culture policy of the Ministry of Culture, for also outlining the main tasks when it comes to creating a level playing field, and about, you know, wishes about whips and carrots. This is something that we are going to talk about later when it comes to arts and antiquities and how market operates. This is indeed what we are going to talk about. This is a high-level conference, and as next I would like to give the floor to an esteemed expert, UNESCO Emergencies Unit and 1970 Convention Secretariat is the top authority when it comes to trafficking. So it's my honor to give the floor to Lazare.
Today, the floor is yours. Good morning.
Good morning. I hope everyone is listening to me. Dear colleagues and ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I'm happy to be here this morning with you at this high-level international conference to discuss this very important topic on the role of the art market in the protection of cultural property against illicit trafficking. Let me first start by saying that the role of the art market is essential, especially in the light of the new challenges that we are facing, and I will come back to it. I think everyone will agree with me when I say that the level of the looting of and the destruction of cultural property that we are witnessing today in 2020, it's unprecedented. The trafficking of cultural property has become a threat to the international peace and security. As you all know, this last decade has been marked by numerous crises and conflicts to which criminal and terrorist organizations have taken advantage of using illicit trade to finance their activities or launder their revenues. It is a fact that since 2014, for instance, ISIS has organized a massive and methodical looting of archaeological sites and museums in the part of Syria and Iraq under its control, and even in other places. The illicit trafficking in cultural property, now believed to be the third largest trade after the drugs and weapons, has only accelerated due to the expansion of the internet now. Internet platforms and social networks have made it possible for traffickers to sell stolen and illegally exported cultural objects more easily and rapidly, rendering this traffic increasingly complex. And this year, the pandemic has affected the surveillance of archaeological sites and museums and made them even more sensitive to illicit excavations and theft. If we are to reverse these trends, we need to work together at the local, national, regional, and global level. And we need to do more to strengthen cooperation between the art market and public institutions. In fact, we need to allow unity to overcome division and facilitate inclusive multilateralism. And this word of multilateralism has been reiterated in the international conference that we had last week, organized in partnership with the authorities of Germany, the European Union, and the European Commission. So let me start by, I would like to say a few words on our media campaign, Know the Real Price of Art, which we launched last month, and that aroused some criticism, not many, but some criticism from some representative of the art market due to mainly some statistics or figures of the art crime that we communicated in the campaign. I think this campaign has been largely applauded by all the member states of UNESCO and the large public. I also want to say it. Today, it's not possible for representative of the art market to maintain in 2020, and some have done following our campaign, which we understand that illicit trafficking of cultural property is decreasing and that it has never financed terrorism. all actors involved should be open-minded, responsible, and stop minimizing the work of all the professionals. Some of them are present today in this issue of the fight against illicit trafficking. All the institutions, the national institutions who have been requesting the United Nations organization to tackle this issue because they consider it absolutely important. And I think if we want to move forward, it is important that we do not only make discussion on figures, but that we also put facts on the table, as it is the only way to make all actors understand the gravity of the situation. If we want to combat illicit trafficking, we must strengthen and unite our efforts. This is what all member states of UNESCO ask us, the only organization that has the mandate within the UN to promote culture and cultural diversity and to fight illicit trafficking of cultural property. And this is one of the main recommendations that came out from the last 3 days online conference, which I mentioned, that we organized with Germany. I think we need more dialogue with all actors, and we will continue to facilitate this dialogue in 2021. We need more solidarity and more cooperation in multilateralism. That's why we can only today welcome today's conference organized by the National Heritage Board of Latvia that brings us together. I think this is important. It will bring out pertinent directions, as you, Master of Ceremony, said at the beginning. You know, this direction will be for reflection and actions, and allow me really to congratulate the organizer for this great initiative. I also take this opportunity to also congratulate Latvia for the ratification of the UNESCO 1970 Convention in January 2019, which is a fundamental, as you have said, treaty for the protection of cultural heritage, cultural property, and the fight against illicit trafficking. And also the 1995 UNIDROIT Convention, which Latvia also ratified in February 2019, which closely complements the 1970 Convention, particularly on issues related to return and restitution. I'm very happy that we are going to discuss it during the 2 days conference. So as we celebrate the 50 and also the 25 years anniversary of these two conventions, today's conference, let me say it with pride, is an opportunity to set common and ambitious goals. We need to push for better acquisition policies, for stricter inquiries on the provenance of cultural objects, and for a more transparent market. And I think I've been trying to say it every time I have an opportunity, that we really need for a more transparent market. And that's what many member states are requesting UNESCO to push for, and also to remind that this is very important. So naturally, UNESCO is committed to making a clear and public distinction. And also something I would like to say right immediately at the beginning of this conference, we want to make a clear distinction between the legal trade in cultural objects and the illegal activities of illicit traffickers. We make it very clearly. We value the importance of implicating art market representatives directly at the international level, as their role is essential to promote the 1970 Convention by pushing for better acquisition policies and insisting on strict ethical rules. Of course, The importance of engaging art market professionals has also been stressed in several United Nations resolutions, such as the resolution 2347 of the UN Security Council, but also the resolution 73/130 of the UN General Assembly. These resolutions underline the dialogue between public institutions and the art market because they consider it crucial to raise awareness and provide education in areas such as provenance investigations, due diligence exercises, return and restitution procedures, the use of practical tools, and appropriate knowledge of the international legal framework. It is in this spirit that UNESCO regularly invites art market representatives to exchange good practices among the art market professional and public authorities. And in 2017, UNESCO, if you remember, launched a 2-year project with the European Union entitled Engaging the European Art Market in the Fight Against Illicit Trafficking of Cultural Property. Let me also come to the issue of ethical, because it is important to have this at the heart of our at the center of our discussion for the 2 days. UNESCO has developed the International Code of Ethics for Dealers in Cultural Property in 1999. On this point, I just would like to underline that although not binding, codes of ethics have an important guidance role, and when largely endorsed, they can reach a degree of moral constraint not inferior to that of a law. Of course, the success of such an instrument depends first on the interest of professional traders concerned to have better acquisition policies, but they also largely depend on the state's abilities to impose appropriate compulsory measures and offer incentives to dealers who undertake to abide by its provision, and buyers also who purchase objects from such dealers. Last week, at the end of October 2020, we had the 8th session of the Subsidiary Committee of the 1970 Convention. So following the session, we here at UNESCO, we are currently working on reviewing this code of ethics to reflect developments in national and international codes of ethics and to strengthen and clarify the ethical principles that should govern the art market. And we will work together with the art market. The most important of these principles are the research on the provenance of cultural objects and the maintenance of a register. It is of paramount importance that traders make stringent inquiries on the provenance of cultural objects with a special attention to the screening of internet offers. When examining the provenance of cultural objects, UNESCO also encouraged traders to consult available database registering art losses, in particular, and I recall it, the Interpol database of stolen art. We also encourage that traders examine carefully the documents from the seller, including export certificates. Traders should also be encouraged to inform the state of origin of any doubt they may have regarding the provenance of a cultural property, and this has been reiterated by some state parties and countries at the last Berlin conference, because they would like also to be sometimes consulted when necessary. So maintaining a register is also important, because the lack of information about the origin of a transferred item is very likely to promote illicit trafficking of cultural property. Art dealers should maintain a register recording the origin of each item of cultural property, names and address of the suppliers, a description and the price of each item sold. We encourage for that the use of the object ID standard that we have to describe cultural objects to facilitate their identification in case of theft. And also, when assessing, and I'm trying to conclude now, whether objects have been illegally exported, professional traders should take into account any worldwide moratorium brought by the United Nations. Progress could also be achieved by requiring traders to take into account the national legislation of an object's country of origin when assessing whether an object has been illegally acquired. So I therefore invite traders to consult the UNESCO database of national cultural heritage laws, which we continue to improve thanks to the voluntary contribution from the Netherlands and Switzerland. Today, more than 3,000 laws from 179 countries are currently listed there. So they are free and they can be consulted at any time. And I would like to end again by thanking the art market representative for their efforts in enhancing the sector's professional rules and increasing awareness on looting of cultural property. The difficulty of curbing online trafficking and the vulnerability of the areas affected necessitate a new level of international mobilization today. All of us, and in particularly the international community and art market association, need to work together to protect this cultural heritage, not only for the sake of protecting them, but for future generation and for the protection of the cultural diversity of our humanity. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Mr. Elandoo. We are absolutely happy to have you here today, and thank you for encouraging words. Paldies Elandoo kungam par kompleksa.
So thank you very much for outlining the scope of problems and different factors that have to be taken into account, and that we will be discussing during these 2 days of conference on how to approach the market ethically, how the market could be self-regulatory, how we can make it more transparent, how to find the right balance between the regulations and free market. And since we are working remotely, sometimes there is, there are some additional technical possibilities, and therefore we have arranged for a special video clip about our heritage as our value and how it goes hand in hand with legal or illegal actions.
Un jā, mantojums ir mūsu.
Indeed, heritage is part of our identity, and we have to treat it with dignity and respect. And this is exactly what we are going to talk about during today's conference. If you have just joined us. We are currently in the sort of opening remarks stage, and I have the pleasure to give the floor now to the next esteemed speaker, Marina Schneider, Principal Legal Officer and Treaty Depository of UniDroit.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Because
we can
you
hear
were
you
cut.
very
You
well.
can hear me. Okay, thank you so much, and good morning to everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you. Unfortunately, not in Riga. I've came several times already, and I hope and I look forward to coming back. But thank you for celebrating with us. I'm happy to see Lazare to celebrate with us our 50th anniversary and 25th anniversary of our conventions. It's most important. And we know that international trade in cultural property is international in nature and of course needs an international response. Lazare very well explained how this also could be done. And of course, international cooperation is the most efficient means to protect the world's cultural heritage. But of course, we know that there is a challenge, and the challenge is to find the balance between protecting the cultural heritage and maintaining the fair place to lawful trade. The trade is obviously economically fundamental too. Objects need to circulate, but of course they must do it lawfully. And this, of course, is the subject matter of this conference. And as you know, it is the subject matter of the UniDroit Convention, which deals with restitution. So it's really between interests which are opposed between the persons. So this means that there is a necessity of the rule of law, because the rule of law makes confidence, it makes economic operation more fluid. And this is needed also with the art market to guarantee the protection of cultural heritage and the legal and financial security of operation and actors in the market. It needs to be regulated. And it's the rule of law which defines the instruments and mechanisms to reassure contracting parties and facilitate licit transactions, but of course also prevent illegal transactions. And we'll have, I'm very looking forward to listening the presentations today and tomorrow. Alessandro Checchi will tell us about how important it is to have an efficient regulatory systems of the market. Of course, international cooperation needs to be done at various levels. We know law enforcement agency, police, customs need to work more on this issue. The judiciary also must cooperate in criminal matters. It's very important that international investigations are done together, and all these cooperation to prevent and combat all forms and aspects of trafficking are reminded to us, if that was needed, by the United Nations Security Council resolutions, in particular the latest, the 2347. What is also extremely important is to enhance, to strengthen the relationship with the private sector, to strengthen due diligence processes. This also was reminded to us by a UN Security Council resolution, the 2253 of 2015. We must ask ourselves, does this mean that we did not do that enough in the past? Maybe. Let us ask us the question and work better on this issue too. It is fundamental. Another way of enhancing international cooperation, of course, is ratifying international conventions. This will help us to enhance best practices in the implementation and improve this cooperation, which is so much needed. Of course, to have a good international cooperation, we need the commitment of states first, nationally, we all know. And this, on this, I'd like really to say that Latvia is an excellent example of this. Latvia, although it's not considered to be an active state on the art market, has acceded to several international treaties because at a time, at least, when illegal trade of cultural property was considered a significant international problem. It is really the years of the UN Security Council's resolutions, 2015, 16. Latvia ratified many UNESCO conventions, also regional conventions, mostly of the Council of Europe, which to show their commitment in this field. And of course, we had the pleasure in 2017 to welcome then Minister of Culture of Latvia, who came to Rome to discuss with us how to better work at acceding to the convention. And as it is very important, Lazar already mentioned it, it's very important that Latvia gave a very important signal by acceding to the 1970 convention and the UNIDROIT convention together. They did the whole procedure together. They ratified it at the same time to show the great synergy and complementarity between the two instruments. And this is very important. We know that there are many instruments, but we need to work on their synergies. And so really Latvia, together, I must say, with another very far country, New Zealand, the two countries did ratify both instruments together to strengthen this complementarity. Also, we know that it's not enough to ratify conventions. They need to be well implemented. And there again, Latvia is a very good example. Latvia has, at the same time, it was 2017, they entered into force, I think in early 2018, the criminal code was amended. And it was amended to insert into the criminal code, specific criminal liabilities. For example, for the illegal trafficking of an object, for the export or the unlawful transfer, if this caused significant damage to the state or the public interest. This is quite interesting also as regards the UNIDROIT Convention, as some of you who know well the convention know that the convention works for the restitution and the return of stolen or illegally exported objects. But we do insist not only on the legal rule, but also the ethical rules and the fact that the damage is created, the fact that an object is stolen or illegally exported is also damage created to the state, to the whole community. Also, Latvia inserted a new criminal liability for illegal acquisition, storage, transfer, export of state-owned antiquities. There again, it is very important to have specific criminalization of offenses against cultural property. And Latvia was also one of the first signatory states to the Nicosia Convention of the Council of Europe. So it was even done, it was at the same time, February 2018, it was signed. So this is really very important. Also, Latvia worked at facilitating the due diligence concept, for example, with a very useful tool. In 2016, Latvia published the catalogue of endangered Latvian archaeological artifacts, and we'll have a presentation tomorrow, I think, on archaeology. So this is very important. It's a kind of ICOM red list for future potential acquirer to understand which are the Latvian objects which are particularly endangered, to be very careful when buying them. And I'll finish this introduction by saying that also what is very important, of course, as we all know, is to sensibilize, to raise the awareness of not only the population, of course, the population is important, but all categories of actors. And I had the pleasure to come to Riga for 2 meetings which were organized by the Latvian School of Public Administration, very interesting seminars on corruption prevention and reduction of shadow economy. Also, I know that in Riga, the Graduate School of Law organized seminars for practitioners, and I see Alessandro saying, yes, I remember he attended, he was one of the presenters. It is very important, and Latvia really is doing what they can and give the very good example. In this, I would like to recall the academic project that UniDroit created to better know how the convention is implemented. And I would like to invite the Latvian, we do have a Latvian lawyer partner of UCAP, but I would really invite all of you to join this academic project and work with us on a better understanding on how it's implemented. The anniversaries we celebrated at UNESCO last week and UniDroit earlier in October showed us how far we are and how many things have been done. Fortunately enough, most of the things that Lazare mentioned this morning are already in instruments. They need to be better implemented. But those celebrations also showed us how far we still need to go. Certainly I'm looking forward to listen to all the interventions today and tomorrow. And again, thank you so much for celebrating with us those anniversaries. Thank you.
Thank you indeed, Madam Schneider, and thank you for uplifting and encouraging words for Latvia regarding this topic, and of course for bringing details in a bigger frame we're going to discuss today. Thank you very much. Paldies liels, Marina Schneider, UniDroit.
Thank you, Marina Schneider, for your speech linking together various aspects of the convention and how Latvia fits into the constellation of the convention, and also detailing other issues that we are going to discuss over these 2 days. And I would like to abuse my authority, if you will, as the moderator, considering that this is the event organized by the National Board, and announce Jan Sasers, who's with me here, and give the floor to him. Thank you. Good afternoon, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues here in Latvia, Europe, and around the world. I had a slightly different introduction, however, following Madam Schneider's kind and positive feedback and her in-depth knowledge of Latvia. I would like to start by thanking her for facilitating cooperation with us, supporting the cooperation with us, and enabling us to more efficiently protect our cultural heritage. The value of the cultural heritage and in shaping our civilization have an enormous role, and it also enriches our economy and social life, bringing together various individual and social groups and communities. As any asset, this asset needs to be treasured. In a globalized world, our access to cultural properties has become a lot easier. Trade has become much more intense. And that, of course, comes with its challenges. Illicit trafficking is, of course, one of the challenges, because illegal market is considered to be the third largest market after drugs and weapons. However, precise figures are, of course, very difficult to be found. In this context, it is absolutely critical to boost the monitoring capacity of responsible authorities and regulate much more stringently the trade in cultural property, improve the regulatory framework and facilitate cooperation between all the stakeholders responsible for the trade in cultural properties. In Latvia, cultural assets are protected by the law on the protection of the cultural heritage, and Cultural Heritage Board is responsible for the implementation or the enforcement of this law. We're primarily responsible for the monitoring of the cultural objects and enforcement of applicable rules. However, in recent years, our functions have significantly broadened due to the fact that in 2019, Latvia joined or exceeded a number of international conventions, and colleagues already mentioned those conventions, but I have to also mention them once again. So UNESCO 1970 Convention on means of prohibiting, preventing illicit import, export and transfer of ownership of cultural property, and also 1995 UNIDROIT Convention. And gradually we're also implementing and ratifying more recent European Council conventions, and Madam Schneider already mentioned one of them, the so-called Nicosia Convention on cultural property crime, aimed at combating or reducing the illicit trafficking of the cultural property and improve market surveillance. Criminal and terrorism organizations are using the arts and antiquities as a source of funding for their operation, and they're of course damaging or looting the cultural heritage and architectural sites. Cultural property shouldn't be bought for illicit proceeds. If there are any suspicions that these are proceeds of illicit activities, contrary to drugs and weapons that are sold on black market and through various underground networks, arts and equities are sold openly on the legal market, and then proceeds are being used for the financing of terrorism. And that is why it is very important to also implement or fight against this illegal market that is being used for terrorism proliferation. And by illegal market, I mean import, export and trade in cultural property, illegal trade. In order to control this trade more efficiently, this February, Cultural Heritage Board created cultural property circulation department to fight with the AML, implement CTF measures, and deal with restitution of irreversibly damaged cultural property. So this direction has become one of the priorities for our board. Although restrictions in time of COVID have reduced our opportunities to conduct on-the-spot checks and investigations, we have nevertheless been very efficient this year. According to our statistics and statistics of police, the number of criminal investigations that have been launched has reached 1,900 cases or property items, out of which artifacts accounted for several hundreds of those items. And we have developed also various brochures to raise the awareness, and I'm just going to show these brochures to you, and these brochures will be circulated amongst the market players and will be also handed over to our colleagues in law enforcement, and will help identify various cultural items and art pieces. And due to the traveling restrictions, because of COVID, the trade based on the export applications has gone down quite significantly, but there are some suspicious cases that we have come across nevertheless. Unfortunately, due to the economic consequences, negative economic consequences of COVID, rising unemployment and closing of companies and restrictions applied to certain industries, as well as the advancement of modern technologies, and I mean metal detectors in this case, have led to looting of
gan cilvēku brīvo laiku.
and illegal digging or black diggers, and we have to step up our efforts to fight against such trends. And this conference is one of important steps because it gives us an opportunity to exchange international experience with some prominent experts. As regards to the organizing of the conference, I have to thank the whole staff of the National Heritage Board. But I would like to specifically thank, or personally thank, my colleague Agnes Chernaya, who was very much involved in organizing and ensured communication with all the experts and arranged all the technical side, or dealt with all the technical issues. So thank you, Ms. Chernaya, thank you to the moderator, and thank you also to other technical support staff. I hope that this conference will promote the cooperation between the institutions that are responsible for the ethical circulation of the property, and will also bring the market players on the same page and enhance understanding of the cultural property value for the national identity and world culture. Thank you. And now we would like to show you a video that we are using to raise the awareness on the value of cultural property and necessity.
Nacionālā kultūras mantojuma pārvalde vērš uzmanību, ka kultūras mantojums ir pamats ikvienas valsts nacionālajai identitātei. Kultūras mantojums ir būtiski nepieciešams mūsdienu kultūras un radošo procesu tālākai attīstībai, veicinot ne tikai intelektuālo, bet arī katras valsts ekonomisko izaugsmi. Kultūras priekšmeti ir daļa no kultūras mantojuma un mūsu vēstures. Tiem ir ievērojama kultūras, mākslinieciskā, vēsturiskā un zinātniskā nozīme. Kā mēs varam novērtēt kultūras mantojuma vērtību? Kultūras priekšmetiem ir neatkārtojama nozīme. Estētiskā vērtība kādā privātā kolekcijā vai finansiālais ieguvums nespēja kompensēt šo priekšmetu zaudējumu, jo tā ir daļa no tautas vēstures un identitātes. Lai kultūras priekšmetus aizsargātu, pastāv ierobežojumi to ievešanai un izvešanai no valsts. Mūsu kultūras priekšmetiem visnopietnākais apdraudējums ir zādzības, nelikumīgi izrakumi un nelikumīga tirdzniecība.
Jā, un, protams, paldies.
I would like to thank the National Heritage Board of Latvia for the initiative to organize this conference. And as we completed the opening speeches, we can now turn to the actual delivery of from our rapporteurs. Let me remind you that afterwards all the articles and speeches will be made available to you. And we will be covering quite wide parts of the world. We will be traveling from UK to Maastricht to Milan University, not to mention those who will be speaking tomorrow when we will hear from the market participants. So now I'm honored to give floor to Alexandro Hecki, who is the senior researcher at the Faculty of Law and the University of Geneva. So
We are seeing you well, and I hope we are hearing you well.
Let's try. Can you hear me?
Yes, very good. Very nice sound.
Good. So it's a pleasure to be here with you today. The introductions from UNESCO, UNITROA from Latvia emphasize the importance of this conference. So I just joined these their words of compliments for organizing this event. So I have a PowerPoint. So let's see if my PowerPoint is not possible. Apparently, I cannot share my screen actually. Is it possible to fix, or I continue without PowerPoint? I can't hear you.
Now you
now
hear me. Now you hear me. Okay.
Yeah.
And you can continue. You can do the presentation now.
Yes, sorry about that. Let me fix this. Perfect. So this is my my topic. I was assigned this topic thinking about an effective regulatory system for the international art market. A very difficult endeavor, I think, but I tried to highlight some points. So in the time I have, I would like to go through these different points to get to the point, how to develop an effective regulatory system. So in the first part, I would like just to explain what we are talking about, where briefly I will look at the illicit trade. Then I will also briefly look at international cultural heritage law framework, so the instruments that have been put in place in the past decades to deal with the problem of illicit trafficking. And then I will spend more time on parts 3 and 4. I want to emphasize that, in fact, there are many calls for the improvement of national laws, policies, and procedures so that the fight against illicit trafficking becomes more effective, efficient. And in the end, I will just propose my ideas on how a national system, a national regulatory system should be, so to respond to the calls from the international community. So, first of all, I would like to acknowledge, as was done by the representative from UNESCO, that of course, our problem is the illicit trafficking, the illicit trade, the black market, but there is also a licit, or as some call it, a legitimate art trade, art market, which is going on not only in traditional outlets like auction houses or galleries, but also today online. And this is one of also the issues. So we are here because there is an illicit trade. So let's focus more on the illicit trade. Of course, there are many reports, many publications. So I just want to recall the principal offenses, how somehow the illicit trade is structured or characterized. There is normally theft from museums, collections, religious buildings, illicit excavation from archaeological sites. Of course, there is the dismemberment of fixtures from sites, buildings and monuments, and also the exportation of all the items stolen or illicitly excavated. So it's obvious, as we all know, that by nature, the illicit trafficking is a transnational phenomenon because looters normally associate with traffickers that export goods, cultural objects abroad, where it's easier to sell them, where it's easier to launder these objects, where it's easier also to escape prosecution. So one of the main characteristics of the illicit trafficking is its transnational nature. Other illicit conducts or infractions are offenses are related to the illicit trafficking, the illicit trade, like corruption, tax offenses, money laundering, falsification of documents, cybercrime offenses like selling actually cultural objects online through platforms, famous platforms like eBay or Facebook, to name just a few. And then the last point, well, this is something that is contested by some. There is evidence, in fact, but not copious of evidence, not established evidence, so to speak, about involvement of organized criminal groups. So this is something that must clarified, but of course there is evidence, as I said, that criminal groups, including terrorist groups, participate indeed in the illicit trafficking, especially in the looting, in the stealing of cultural objects, especially in poor countries or conflict-affected areas. Why is that so? Why criminal groups are interested in the art market or in the trade in cultural objects? There are many reasons established by researchers, and one is that the international art market is characterized by secrecy. So, as one researcher said, secrecy can foster abuse, and that's why in the art market we find objects that have been looted, stolen by members of criminal organizations. And now I would like to already somehow come to the conclusion of the first part, where I want to recap a little bit. It must be established that the illicit trade is not something separate from the licit market. In fact, the two markets, the two trades run in parallel. And one reason is that all cultural objects cannot easily, of illicit provenance, cannot be distinguished easily from objects with a licit pedigree if there are no documents, because cultural objects are intrinsically legal assets. And then another reason is that the legal prohibitions or the prohibition for exportations that are adopted by exporting countries, the so-called source countries, are not still or yet automatically recognized in other states, in the so-called market states. So there is somehow various situations, various problems leading to this effect. The illicit trade runs in parallel with the licit trade. So we have, in fact, various examples demonstrating from various countries, from Italy to the US to the UK, the country where I live, Switzerland, demonstrating that it has been easy for certain dealers, criminal dealers, or criminal to profit of this situation in order to sell objects abroad, far from the country of origin. Here we have the picture of Medici, that was arrested in the 90s following a police cooperation between the police of Italy and Switzerland. Here two pictures of relating to a case concerning the US, Hobby Lobby, famous case, and the sarcophagus found in Geneva, the Freeport, now back in Turkey. There are 2 points that I would like to emphasize. So there is, as I said, a licit market that works together with an illicit trade, but we must emphasize that there is somehow a sort of synergy, cooperation between art market professionals and criminals, which can be in some cases conscious, voluntary, in some other cases just unconscious, just situations where market operators are just abused by criminals. But as a matter of fact, there is a collusion, there is a sort of synergy that allows the illicit market to thrive. And this is true. In fact, we have researchers that have used the definitions of crimes of the powerful or white-collar crimes to those involved precisely in the illicit trade in cultural objects, to identify the persons that have the wealth, the power to avoid prosecution, to avoid responsibility, or to, of course, I'm talking about persons that are established in the in market countries. So it is probably the time to stress that I don't believe, and that was said also by the representative of UNESCO, that the art market is always complicit of traffickers. Not at all. The last point that you see in the slide, the Responsible Art Market, is an initiative that is active, is at the University of Geneva, and this initiative, the Responsible Art Market, is done by experts, but also members of the art market. So it's true, precisely thanks to this initiative that we are aware that there are many market operators that don't want to be abused by criminals. They don't want to be involved in awkward dealings. They actually want to respect the law. So this is what I want to stress here. We have to talk about the illicit trafficking, but we must acknowledge that the vast majority of the professionals of the art trade, from auctioneers, from curators, dealers, gallerists, etc., they want to abide by the law. So they are good citizens, so to speak. So that was my introduction. Now I'm moving more quickly through the second part of my presentation, where I want to emphasize the main elements of the existing legislation. So I'm not going to analyze all the conventions that you see in the screen. Don't worry. Here I'm just recalling what are the instruments adopted by here UNESCO with the 1954 convention, the convention from 1970, and the UNIDROIT convention, which have been mentioned before by representatives by UNESCO and UNIDROIT. I would like to mention also the Underwater Cultural Heritage Convention from 2001, also relevant in the fight against the illicit trafficking. Then it is also necessary, as we are in Europe, to highlight the efforts of the Council of Europe with a convention from 1954 and the Convention of Archaeological Heritage of 1992. And I conclude my list here with the instruments adopted by the European Union in the past decade. Regulation and a directive to update the system, the protective system that was adopted in the 90s, and then finally the regulation from 2019 on the introduction and import of cultural goods. So we have a very complex arsenal of legal measures at the international level. But these are instruments that, of course, have been adopted to complement national laws. So Marina Schneider, with her presentation, clearly established the connection between the responsibilities of international organizations and states. They have to cooperate. So international instruments, the international instruments that I've mentioned have been adopted precisely to complement, to strengthen the responses given at the national level. But then we have to also to consider the problems of these, not only the pros of these legal instruments, but also the problems, the shortcomings. So we have to say that these international legal instruments try to address the illicit trafficking through cooperation and trade restrictions. They aim at the return and restitution to facilitate the return and restitution of cultural objects. But this is not sufficient. And in fact, we have to admit that most of these international legal instruments do not provide for punitive responses to offenses related to cultural objects. Some instruments do not contain clauses at all. Some instruments leave to states the establishment of the type of sanction for offenders, for criminals. And also these international instruments acknowledge the existence of a licit, legitimate art market, but do not try to regulate, to control the activities, the conduct of art market operators. This is again left to states, and here I suppose, well, states are always behind the text of a treaty, of an instrument, so we can only imagine that states did not want regulations or conventions to deal with precisely the responsibilities of those directly involved in the trade in cultural objects. We must say that these characteristics, so these shortcomings, the shortcomings of international legal instruments can be observed also at the national level. So in many states, of course not in all states, but in many states, we observe the same problems. In many states, criminal law does not in fact contain clear legal prohibitions and strong sanctions against those involved in offenses related to cultural objects. In many states, in fact, other crimes are more important. So there is no really interest in modifying the criminal code to cover art crimes. And also, in many states, there is no adequate control of the activities of our market operators. And so let's say the preferred law enforcement option is that of confiscating objects and then to ensure their restitution to the country of origin. So there's not much interest in prosecuting, or rather in prosecuting and punishing those involved. This is, of course, related to the difficulty of finding thieves, finding the intermediaries, finding and proving the intention of smugglers. So there are many difficulties, and therefore we have to admit that there are limits at the national level. And then I come to the third point. We in many states, of course not in all states, we have states that did not manage to reduce anonymity and confidentiality in their market. The consequence of all of this is that in many states, apparently there is no political will to use criminal law, these options, the criminal law instrument to reduce, or actually to increase compliance and to reduce the trafficking is not well utilized, is not frequent. And therefore there are little cases, not so many cases of criminal cases demonstrating that culprits are in fact put in jail. So there is also a little deterrent effect in the end. But let me now move to the third part of my presentation, as time is running fast. I have to go quickly through the instruments that are adopted by the Security Council, and here I can just take advantage of the intervention of the UNESCO representative, mentioning that the UN intervened also with the support of UNESCO because the trafficking is considered a threat for international peace and security, so is within the mandate of the Security Council. Then it's also interesting to consider the role of the United Nations Convention against Transnational Organized Crime. As you know, this convention has been widely ratified and applies when a criminal activity is committed by an organized criminal group, is defined as a serious crime according to the text of the convention, and that activity is also transnational in nature. And as I said before, all these, or in many cases, these are the characteristics of crimes, offenses related to cultural objects. So this convention can be used, can be applied by states in relation to offenses related to cultural objects. And we have to admit that this treaty, in fact, does not contain a specific article on cultural objects, but its provisions on money laundering, its provisions on police cooperation, they are very important in this regard. And to explain the relevance of this convention, I would like quickly to come to the guidelines, international guidelines adopted by UNODC, which is the body charged with the implementation of the United Nations Convention. With the UNODC developed international guidelines, which are supposed to help or guide, inform states on how to revise, if necessary, national legislation, national procedures, so to become more effective in the fight against the illicit trafficking. So here again, you can see that states are encouraged to consider adopting legislation criminalizing trafficking in cultural property, for instance. They are also invited to criminalize serious offenses, acts such as the trafficking, illicit export and import, theft, etc., etc. Introducing in their criminal legislation other offenses such as acquiring trafficked cultural property. And then, finally, undertaking appropriate measures to identify, trace, seize, and confiscate trafficked cultural objects. So, with these, I wanted to demonstrate that there is beyond the treaties that we know, treaties from UNESCO, from UNIDROIT, other treaties that can apply to the trafficking and that can be used by states. Then let me also quickly come to a sector that is more relevant for a discussion on illicit trafficking. I'm talking about money laundering. Money laundering refers to the process through which illegally obtained assets are transformed into apparently clean funds. So there are two main techniques that are relevant for our discussion, money laundering techniques that must be mentioned here. So there is the simple situation when traffickers or criminals buy cultural objects with cash coming from illicit activities, so money coming from drug trafficking, for instance. And then, of course, the problem here is not that criminals acquire art, but is that these objects then can be easily transported, sold again, so the criminals can obtain clean money, probably to continue with their illicit activities. That's one technique. The second technique is actually exemplified by the Medici case that I mentioned before, when fictitious sales are organized so that the trafficker asks a friend, a colleague, an accomplice to buy the object on the market with money provided by the trafficker, so that at the end of this procedure, the trafficker obtains an object with a certificate somehow issued by an auction house, for instance, or a dealer, demonstrating that an object was sold on that date for a specific amount of money, giving an apparently licit provenance. So it is a problem, money laundering, it is a problem in the art market, there is no doubt. We can say that there are other, there are few characteristics of the art market that facilitates the use of money laundering techniques in the art market, such as I said before, the secrecy or the confidentiality, which is common in this sector, but also the fact that in many cases buyers or intermediaries use agents, use offshore companies. So there are many possibilities that facilitates the use of money laundering in the art market. And again, we go back to the lack of anti-money laundering rules in many states, because the art market, it is regulated in the sense that market operators have to respect contracts, ethical rules, rules concerning, for instance, endangered fauna or flora and fauna, Nazi-looted art. They have to respect criminal law rules and VAT rules. So there is a rule, but not specific rules on anti-money laundering. And there are, in this sense, steps that are being taken at the international level to, in fact, convince states to develop rules in this sense to avoid, to prevent, to fight money laundering at the national level. So the Security Council resolutions have been mentioned before. Essentially, I'm thinking about the famous resolution 2347 of 2017. Member states of the United Nations are invited to reduce the freedom that market operators normally have. This is the main somehow message or request actually of the Security Council. And then, more importantly, I would like to say a few words about the fifth money laundering directive from 2018. This is the first directive of the European Union focusing on money laundering in the art market. So there are now provisions which are binding for all members of the European Union to bring in within the regulated sectors those working with cultural objects. So persons trading or acting as intermediaries in the art, in the trade of works of art, and persons storing, trading, or acting as intermediaries in relation to transactions with amounts to 10,000 euro or more, well, they have now obligations like any other professional of the financial sector. So they have to carry out detailed checks regarding the identity of the persons involved in the transactions. They have to check the origins of the money. They have to keep records. They have to also inform authorities in case of suspicious transactions. And then the last point, I think my time is really running out. I would like to say a few words about the Financial Action Task Force. This is a sort of international organization, and it's important to mention here because, well, it doesn't, it never issued established guidelines for the market itself, but in relation to the country where I live, Switzerland, FATF adopted a couple of reports. And as a result of these reports, Switzerland actually modified national legislation so as to avoid the vulnerabilities or to reduce the vulnerabilities at the national level. Vulnerabilities, again, in relation to money laundering. So even the recommendations of the Financial Action Task Force are important, should be taken into account by states, of course, member states. So this is also an incentive for states to become member of this organization. So now, well, I would like to skip these for time reason. Is the recent Convention of the Council of Europe that it was not on my list before because I wanted to say a few words now, but I think I'm running late. So the thing is that this convention, after all, is not yet in force. So my final part, a few slides to take stock of what I said so far, to profit from what I said so far. What should be done by states to create an effective, efficient system for avoiding, fighting, preventing illicit trafficking. So, first of all, states should ratify all international treaties, existing international treaties, but also implement them carefully, properly at the national level, so that all states will provide for import restrictions, but also due diligence requirements and effective, proportionate and dissuasive penalties. And of course, this first point applies to all states, but of course this becomes, this point has a different importance for the European, for the members of the European Union, because they are obliged to comply with the new regulations on export and import, and on the directive on money laundering. Then, of course, as was emphasized by the representatives from UNESCO and UNIDROIT, we need strong interstate cooperation to disseminate best practices and to regulate online marketplaces. Cooperation is key at these different levels because we have to really reduce the space for criminals. We have to really give them hard times to find where to export illicit objects. And then I move to the third point. States should also strive to create specialized law enforcement units. I'm coming from Italy, and I can provide, of course, the obvious example of the Carabinieri, enforcement units with capacity, of course, to deal with offenses related to cultural property. Then these national specialized units or other entities like ministries should also strive to collect, analyze, and disseminate data and statistics concerning illicit trafficking. Then I would like to also to mention, this is my final slide, that states, to the extent possible, they should also somehow support those countries, the victims of the illicit trafficking, the first victims of illicit trafficking. Also, states, national authorities should raise awareness among our market professionals so that they don't think that they can actually rescue objects if they have no provenance. So this is they are just deluding themselves if they think that it's about rescuing cultural objects with no provenance. They are just fostering more trafficking. And then finally, a point that I really like, states should individually or in cooperation with others provide research grants for researchers that want to study illicit trafficking, because there are many aspects that we still don't know, and we need knowledge to fight better, efficiently the worldwide illicit trafficking. So I think I spoke too much, but at least I concluded my presentation providing my ideas on how to build effective regulatory systems. Thank you for your attention, and I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Keki, and really thank you for extremely informative and very well organized presentation, and a lot of this information definitely going to serve us for the tomorrow's afternoon discussion we're going to have. Un tā, dāmas un kungi, tā, Dr.
So, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Keki outlined the legal aspects of the arts and antiquities market regulation. Let's now go over to the next speaker with a little video clip in between to make this day a bit brighter. UNESCO video on cultural property and any wrongdoings with regard to cultural property.
Un tā mēs redzējām lielisku UNESCO video.
So this was a video from UNESCO which shows how the money laundering schemes work, which of course coincides with today's topic of our conference. And now I will give floor to the next speaker, Associate Professor Dr. Donna Yates, in the Department of Criminal Law and Criminology, University of Maastricht, who will be talking about the grey antiquities market, what works, what doesn't, and a way forward.
Hi, thank you. I am now going to start sharing my screen. Hopefully everybody can hear me. There we go. Hopefully you can see this, yes. I'm sure somebody would tell me if you couldn't.
Okay.
That's a very dramatic video to follow. I don't think I'll be quite as entertaining as that. First of all, thank you very much. I am very happy to present this presentation on behalf of myself and my co-author, Diana Berzinger. And I should say, first of all, I'm following two lawyers, and though Diana and I are in the department of, in the faculty of law at Maastricht, we are both criminologists. So we will be coming at this idea of regulating the antiquities market from a more criminological point of view. So moving right along, I want to talk about the antiquities market as a gray market and how we can approach regulating a gray market. And really, the fact that the antiquities market is a gray market is one of the primary issues here. It makes the antiquities market, the illicit antiquities market, very difficult to control. And if we want to develop effective regulatory responses to the illicit trade in cultural goods and other crimes within this market, it's really important that we understand these points of grayness and that we address them. So hopefully the slides change. They do. Excellent. Within criminology, grayness, what do I mean by grayness? Within criminology, grayness and gray markets have been defined in two ways. And we see both of these definitions of grayness within the illicit trade for cultural goods. So the first way that grayness has been defined within criminology is the hard to assess zone between two poles. So what do I mean by that? I mean that in this conception, there is a moral, legal, appropriate, and right way to be. There's a correct way to act. There is a good way to act. And there is an inappropriate, immoral, and illegal way to act. And both of these are well defined. But in between the two, there's a gray area where certain actions and activities haven't really been defined yet by the laws and norms that we have. So there might one day be a correct interpretation of these actions. They might be defined as legal or illegal one day, but how things stand, our laws and norms and ethics don't yet provide guidance on that. So in a sense, we're waiting for more information. The other way that grayness has been defined when it comes to markets from criminology is grayness as a mixing of tainted and illegal things and activities and clean and legal activities, creating a market that is neither entirely clean and not entirely tainted either. So sort of like black and white paint coming together to make gray paint. Illegal and legal become almost indistinguishable. They become so mixed up that you can't really separate them anymore. And again, I assert, so to explain again, number one, there's a right way, but we don't know what it is yet. And number two, right and wrong have just become inseparably mixed. And we see both of these in the antiquities market. I don't want to go too far into this. A colleague of mine and I have a paper out on this. If you're interested, we can send you links. Ways that you see grayness in the antiquities market, you can see the market itself is gray because mixed supply streams, legal and illegal antiquities can flow from the same sources through similar pathways. They could be indistinguishable from each other. You can't really tell if something's legal or illegal, illicit or illicit on the market. The objects themselves can be considered gray because of efforts to mask the origins of the objects through false provenances, actions that launder the objects but never fully clean them. And then you can consider market actors, such as dealers, such as ourselves, as gray because of moral ambiguity about what actions are right and wrong, about shifting ideas of what is ethical behavior and what isn't. It's very difficult often to navigate those spaces. So I assert that market regulation is needed, more market regulation is needed, and I think the people speaking today so far agree with me there. And in this talk, we would like to discuss 3 possible pathways towards more effective market regulation for this gray market. The first I'm going to talk about is regulation beyond the idea of the market policing itself. The second I'm going to talk about is supporting new technology for policing that actually meets the needs of police. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about examining our own roles as experts and what role experts play in maintaining grayness within the market. Hopefully I have time for all of these. If I don't, the full paper will be available soon, I'm told. So to explain a little bit where a lot of this information came from, last year I and several colleagues released a report for the European Commission on the illicit trade in cultural goods in Europe. And as part of that report, we interviewed a lot of people and collected a lot of data. I don't want to go too far into the methodology, but we gathered data through literature reviews, through interviews, through surveys, through snapshot analyses, through case study research. And I should say Alessandro, who just spoke, was involved in this as well. So thank you, Alessandro. In total, we did 36 interviews. And as you can see, most of our interviews focused on law enforcement agents working in this area in Europe and customs agents, as well as some others. And in addition to interviews, we also did surveys. We actually contacted over 700 people to take the surveys. We got 124 complete responses. So anybody watching this, answer surveys when you're sent surveys. It's very helpful. But this was kind of an acceptable and expected response rate. So we got 124 responses from 39 countries. And quite interestingly, the survey responses, as you'll see here, were actually mostly from the trade. We had 25 art dealers, 33 collectors respond, and then 27 university researchers and academics, then followed by museums people. So in the surveys, yes, we probably had overrepresentation from the market sector, but I think this was actually valuable because in our interviews, we're talking to the police, in our surveys, we're talking to the market. So we got a pretty interesting picture of what's going on. So again, this is where a lot of the data I'm presenting comes from. If you want to see the full report, it's available for free online. And just to remind, I'm going to be talking about these three aspects of regulating this gray market. So starting out with number one, not depending on self-regulation. So what do I mean by this? Well, generally speaking, there's an idea that an under-regulated market will just do the right thing because market actors profit from avoiding actions that harm their business. However, and unfortunately, it's often very profitable to do the wrong thing, which can encourage market actors in any market to do that wrong thing. And within the market for cultural goods, we have a point of tension. The market demands cultural objects that are at times potentially illicit. And we have a general societal desire to prevent illicit antiquities from coming to market, to preserve these cultural objects. And so to me, this doesn't seem like a place for self-regulation. Yet self-regulation generally is more inexpensive than more intensive regulation where you have to have regulatory oversight bodies or criminalization, which is very expensive. And we also tend to assume that white-collar actors, so elite people doing elite jobs, are not criminals, that they want to do the right thing. And again, coming from criminology, it's this very gap where white-collar crime occurs, where we have a lack of regulation and a general social assumption that that people are going to do the right thing, even when there's incentives for them to do the wrong thing. So in generally within this market, we see assertions from market actors that support this call, that support the market policing itself, that support wanting self-regulation. And one of those that we often see is the assertion that objects with better provenance sell better. So objects that you can prove are not so illicit, or at least a bit not illicit, or potentially legal, sell better. However, a lot of research shows that aesthetics and authenticity tend to drive buyer behavior, not extensive or clean provenance. That's not always the case, but it seems to be a chief concern. And further on the market for cultural goods, there are whole classes of cultural objects that are sold almost entirely without provenance. That's the expected state for them to be sold in, because sellers know that provenance isn't the key for these transactions. And so far, no academic market study has clearly connected good provenance to increased market value. So there's a problem with that statement. Second, we've done lots of interviews from market actors that say that buyers tend to shun bad actors. So buyers will avoid market actors who have poor reputations or have a past of dealing with illicit material. However, this is problematic as well, because who is and isn't dodgy, who isn't a bad actor, isn't immediately evident to most buyers. Significant time and research is needed to see if market traders have a questionable past. At this point, I might know who might be considered questionable after doing this for 15 years, but somebody who's just getting into buying cultural material doesn't have the toolkit to recognize that. We also can see within this market that even traders with convictions in one or more jurisdictions seem to continue to trade extensively and openly. So there's not a lot of shunning going on in all cases. And further, the opacity of this market allows disgraced traders to enter the market in other ways. So I like this old cartoon of, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. On the internet, no one knows that you're an antiquities trader with multiple convictions. So it's kind of easy to hide bad actions within this market. And then finally, there's the constant assertion that the market will police itself. And in many ways, we've relied on this for decades, yet we are still here having this conference, having this discussion, meaning that the reliance on the market policing itself is not really working. There's no reason for the market to police itself because it's more work and less profit. It's hard to police yourself. There's no carrot because there isn't necessarily a benefit to self-policing. There's not a financial benefit to it. There's no stick because nothing's going to happen to you really if you don't. So moving on from there, what are some recommendations we could bring forward? And I should say after each of these three sections, I'm going to give some recommendations to deal with this idea of regulating beyond self-regulation. And in this case, in all cases, I know I'm speaking almost towards fantasy. These are hopeful, wishful thinking regulations that I hope will provoke discussion. They're not necessarily anything that we could do tomorrow, but it's something that these are things that are worth thinking about. So one thing we could think about would be some sort of licensing scheme for all dealers, and that all sales of cultural objects must go through licensed dealers. We could have a European standard for licensing. A girl can dream. The result would be that bad actors would get their license revoked and then they can't trade. And we could increase buyer confidence through this type of licensing scheme. So buyers who don't necessarily have a lot of information about this market can look into licensing and see if they're buying from somebody who is legitimate. And through this licensing scheme, we could ensure a minimum standard for training in due diligence, in law and regulation, and so on among traders. And we can keep a high level of market education in that area. We could go even further and have compulsory registry of all stock and transactions, which some states do have this, or at least they're supposed to, where sellers must register all their stock in a centralized registry. Transactions would be recorded in this registry, and registry entries would be available to buyers and potentially law enforcement. Again, this would bring more buyer security into the market because buyers would have a record of provenance and sales for the thing that they're buying. And from a law enforcement side, it creates a new violation. So a trader who doesn't register their object or sells an object that isn't in the registry has broken a law, and a very clear law, and it's something that law enforcement can work with. It isn't a violation that deals with what somebody did or didn't know or shouldn't know. They didn't register their stuff, it's a violation. We could extend this to online sales and make sure that these rules apply to all sellers and not just high-end auction houses and dealers, which would eliminate the financial incentive on these platforms for looking the other way. And another thing we could do would be support training towards independent provenance research. Move provenance research on these objects outside of the hands of the people who have a financial stake in the result. Because again, it often pays to ignore bad provenance. So we could foster development in this sector, such as master's programs, incentives for private provenance research to ensure the market, and so on. So again, wishful thinking, but I hope, again, to provoke discussion with these. So number two, another way to deal with grayness in the market is to think about policing and think about the technology that we can develop to aid in policing efforts in this area. So moving back to this EU study, lately the thinking inside EU institutions when it comes to technology and the illicit trade in cultural goods is that perhaps opportunities to use the new technology in this area have been passing us by. There's some feeling that, to use the idiomatic phrase, that wheels are being reinvented, that multiple projects and groups and law enforcement agencies who are dealing with the same problems are spending a lot of time making parallel technology solution to those problems when they could be pooling their efforts together. And really, generally, it feels like technology should solve our problems in this area, doesn't it? It really feels like we should be able to do that. So this is becoming a priority area. And meanwhile, we've been wanting to focus on this for some time. And we approach technology in this area as technology lovers, but also technology skeptics. Because over the past years and decades, technology has been applied to the illicit trade in cultural goods in kind of not necessarily always successful ways. We see something that I've been calling, since I saw this somewhere else, databases to nowhere. So databases of information that are created and then are no longer maintained. They're not updated, and thus they lose their usefulness. We see dead platforms. So digital platforms for communication are the things that are created and then abandoned, and then they just become almost ruins themselves. And we get really strange press coverage and press releases, often from startups, saying this new technology we created will end the illicit trade in cultural goods in some way that's not really clear to the rest of us. So when the study that I spoke of came out, the European Commission called specifically for research on this topic, and we were very excited to do that. So specifically, we evaluated the impact, effectiveness, and added value of technological tools. European Commission report, and we did this kind of divided it in two ways. First, we looked at what kind of technology is currently within use in Europe to combat the illicit trade in cultural goods. And we looked at what kind of technology isn't in use but might be usefully applied. So I'm going to talk through that really quickly. So what's currently in use among law enforcement that they think is and how do they think about it? So this is again coming from our interviews and surveys. Well, one kind of technology that's seen quite positively and that's currently in use are web crawlers and image recognition work. So these are tools that scrape the visible web for data and tools that recognize patterns and images. So these are tools that are kind of scraping market sites and social media platforms to look for things that might potentially be illicit. And our respondents felt that these were flexible, customizable, and quite cheap. They were considered very positive and desirable. And very importantly, the use of these tools mirror what was seen as a major shift in the trade to online sales. The market has moved online, and these are tools that specifically address a market and an illicit market that is now largely online, or at least detectable online. However, there were some bad aspects of these as well. They generate a lot of data. They require trained human eyes. And often they generate more data than there are trained human eyes within law enforcement to deal with that data. So this is getting to be a problem. Our respondents liked databases. They said that these databases can facilitate cross-border cases, cutting down friction. They can be paired with big data, network, and other analyses, though none reported actually doing that. They just know it's possible and would like to. However, there are bad sides to databases as well. Very important to emphasize, they only relate to stolen goods, not antiquities that are looted out of the ground. Many informants pointed this out. You can't have records for something that you have no records for. Something that's just come out of the ground after 1,000 years doesn't have a database entry. They noted that there's a lot of variable quality in database entries. There's issue with upkeep of the database. And there are also barriers to accessing some databases. Some are private, some have to have special permission. And another thing, staffing again is a problem. They need specialized staff to do manual searching of these databases. And they note that manual searching is still the norm. There's not some magical AI that's doing the search for them. It's an officer sitting there doing the searches themselves. Any other things that came up that they said that was in use and that were good? Not really. Some informants mentioned various communication platforms that they use in conjunction with other agencies. But most of them said, even with those, it's easier to just call other law enforcement agencies on the phone. And really, despite all these headlines about possible new technologies, the agencies aren't really using those, and they're often of limited interest. They mostly want funding to support what they actually have. I'm going to go through very quickly because I know my time is limited. What kind of tech that isn't in use that might be useful if applied? Trick question, nobody mentioned anything. It could have just been a lack of imagination on their part, but I don't think so. Talking to law enforcement agents here, they said really that for many of these things, there's no operational need for a lot of these suggested new technologies. Even if there was, they wouldn't have the budget to implement. A lot of these agencies noted they barely have enough funding allotted to them to have any staffing at all. A lot of them are having staff cut. They can't really afford new technologies. And a lot of this technology is what I call technology in search of an application. It wasn't created for this issue and doesn't really apply to this issue very well. So what do agencies need? Well, it's obvious. They need money to deal with this issue, and they need political will internally to support policing in this area. So really, we found that there's no clear technology gap when it comes to dealing with the gray market in cultural goods. Informants didn't really think that technology tools would immediately solve their existing problems. But capacity, like just staffing, was the main barrier. Those who wanted to use more technology or make better use of what they had just reported a lack of funding for staff. And many reported that this topic is a low priority within law enforcement agencies. So all told, our recommendations, we have a lot of them, they're in the report. I don't want to go too far into them. We think one thing that really can be done is improving capacity for monitoring online sales. And I think this could go a long way in dealing with the gray market for antiquities. This could mean supporting development of easy to implement toolkits based on technology that's already working for some forces within the EU. We can fund partnerships between academia and law enforcement to tailor what's available to meet real operational needs. And just moving right along, very importantly, we should provide sustained funding for this, particularly with regard to staffing within police agencies. So really, we need staffing first, then development second. We need security for our law enforcement agencies when it comes to dealing with this gray market before we can really talk about fancier things than that. And security is something that Unfortunately, many of the law enforcement agencies that do have dedicated law enforcement in this area just don't have. So the final aspect that I want to talk about dealing with regulating this gray market is considering the role of experts. I imagine that most people watching this or participating in this, conference are experts in cultural goods in some way. It may be that you are work within the law, it may be you work within policy, or you may be archaeologists, conservators, museum people, and so on yourselves. And I may be controversially here, but I'm asserting that experts actually do play a strong role in maintaining grayness within this market. And this is something that we need to address as well. So, like I said, when it comes to facilitating the market, professional and experts play a huge role. We are conservators, valuers, scientists, authenticators, and other researchers that look at objects, interact with objects, and these interactions affect value on the market. And we do rarely consider how even the most normal aspects of our work support the illicit trade in cultural goods and support the graying of this market. Many professional codes of ethics restrict engagement with unprovenance material. And you can hear me almost hearkening back to what I'm talking about before with the market policing itself. These codes of ethics expect experts to police themselves. And again, that doesn't always work out so well. These codes of ethics, of course, seem quite clear on paper, but in practice, they're not so black and white. They're gray. They're often applied unevenly, they're subject to interpretation, and there's very little punishment for violation. Often they're just a box that you tick when you renew your membership in whatever organization every year. Yet our professional interactions with directly the illicit market or just objects that are unprovenanced occupy an ethically ambiguous gray zone. And though these actions, whether it be authentication, whether it be restoration, whether it be cleaning, whether it just be offering an opinion, though these actions are far from the act of looting or smuggling, how an individual expert chooses to navigate this gray zone is not neutral. Refusing to interact could disrupt the trade in some small way. Agreeing to interact can facilitate all the way down the line organized crime and the destruction of the past in some small way. And that's not something to be taken lightly. So when it comes to interacting with unprovenance objects, what one professional might consider to be an allowable level of uncertainty about an object's origin may not be acceptable to another expert. We don't normally think about it this way, but we experts in heritage create value on the antiquities market. Our actions determine if an antiquity is priceless or if it's worthless. As I mentioned before, some research shows that authenticity is far more important on the market than provenance is. Yet experts, when it comes to using our expertise, our connoisseurship, our scientific techniques, we are the gatekeepers of authenticity. Without professional participation in the market, looted antiquities aren't fully authenticated. Thus, they're not valuable and not sellable, at least not at prices that make it worthwhile to engage in the illicit trade. So in a way, if you think about it, we can start to destabilize an illicit market, a gray market that depends on us. Because if demand creates supply, we can reduce looting and trafficking of antiquities by not supporting the illicit trade in certain ways. This, of course, is very difficult to do because, like the trade in antiquities, expertise has grown up around the trade and ways to support the trade. So how can we start this destabilization of the gray market in antiquities from the side of expertise? Well, we can start getting serious about ethics. We can make ethics not just a tick box that we do when we renew our membership in some organization. We can embed it in all aspects of our practice, and how to do that, that's a longer discussion, but there is a lot of work being done on that right now within museums in all aspects of museums, particularly around decolonization, we can work the illicit trade into that as well. We can work hard educating professionals and students in this area. One thing we can do is break silence. We can make easier pathways for experts to discuss the unethical things they've seen and the ways they may have felt pressured or in various ways in dealing with illicit or in-provenance material. And from that, we can build community support for creating a bank of support for helping do the more positive things for again, destabilizing illicit material on the market. So I think I'm right at my time. I'm sorry if it was a bit long, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor, very much for extremely rich in information presentation and very interesting either. So thank you for your input in this conference and the questions you raised, including those questions on wishful thinking. Those we will discuss tomorrow in the afternoon discussion session. Un tā, mēs arī turpinām, Professor.
So we will now continue from where Professor Yates left off. We are going to focus further on the technologies and the role of the technologies with Elizabeth Lazaro from the United Kingdom, from the creative universities and businesses, who's going to talk about blockchain and challenges on art market.
We are now giving the floor to you on the blockchain topic and all the possibilities in the art market considering that. Good day. There is...
Good morning,
yeah.
everybody.
Everything's fine now, yes.
I would like to thank the National Board of Latvia for inviting me. So today, let me please share my screen.
Everything okay?
I hope you can see it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's good.
All right. So today I will talk about blockchain opportunities and challenges on the art market. So I will bring the perspective of an art economist, as I am. Actually, I've been working on the economics of the art market for more than 20 years. And in particular on aspects linked to authenticity, copies, fakes, illegal markets, and the corresponding regulatory aspects. More recently, I've co-authored a strategic report for the European Institute of Innovation and Technology of the European Union, bringing together cultural heritage, public policies, academia, research and innovation and practice in the sense of enterprise and business. And more broadly, this part of research is part of a broader research program we are conducting at the Business School for the Creative Industries at the University for the Creative Arts, merging technology activity. So a major concern on the art market is to get correct and secure information about artworks in order to reduce uncertainty and increase transparency against the risk of forgeries and frauds. And my thesis today is to present blockchain as a possible solution for artworks, authentication, provenance, and traceability, and the validity of this information. So the art market, as we know, is still a traditional sector. If we add blockchain to the art market, we get disruption. although the core of the market is still offline, as we are aware of. So what is blockchain? Blockchain is defined as a decentralized digital ledger allowing users to store information in a secure and permanent way. In this way, blockchain represents reliability, trust, and traceability. As such, the blockchain technology dates back to more than 10 years ago. We are all aware of Bitcoin, the cryptocurrency Bitcoin. Although blockchain, the technology of blockchain has been applied to various economic sectors, including more recently the art market. And as such, blockchain applied to the art market is a potential still far from full exploitation, including practice as well as research. So if we consider blockchain in the context applied to the art market, consider blockchain as an endogenous, anonymous, distributed, and self-regulated certification. I can hear some echo. Can you hear me correctly? All right.
Yes.
Certification,
yes. Okay.
Alternative to a centralized legal certification, so the traditional state of the art, based on an official register with identification, including tax of the artwork owner. As such, blockchain contributes transparency to transactions in terms of authentication and provenance of art objects. It reduces the uncertainty through a distributed ledger and timestamp on transactions, guaranteeing about authenticity and previous collectors of the artwork. It reduces the share of fakes on the market, and especially the so-called gray zone that discriminates between truly authentic and potential fake artworks. And from a regulatory perspective, it opens new perspectives and challenges in terms of how art market professionals could and should position themselves in the face of these emerging practices. So, authenticity and blockchain. So if we look at the art market from a traditional perspective in terms of traditional issues and approaches, authenticity on the art market means provenance, connoisseurship, and forensics. More recently, we can add to these issues and especially approaches the new technologies, including the blockchain, in terms of provenance, authentication, verification, and asset identities areas of intervention. The targets of blockchain applied to the art market are quite varied. They include artists, talking about contemporary art, as well as collectors, galleries, auction houses, and other intermediaries like fairs and art market platforms, if we consider the art market online. And these targets are both institutional and individual stakeholders. So if we have to resume what are the main advantages of blockchain, these advantages include the open and interconnected network of supply chains with up-to-date real-time information available to all participants, where these participants are allowed to read, write, audit, and other actions connected with the blockchain. Another important advantage of blockchain applied to the art market is that it ensures full visibility of the entire history of the work of art and improved safety through full disclosure of information except confidential data. So confidentiality is still ensured. Again, blockchain is a single source of reliable information. We will see in the next slide that this can also be a challenge. Blockchain is also allows for flexibility and transparency of stakeholders' engagement. And it identify problems arising from logistics operations with art objects. So an issue that we have been considering earlier this morning. If we consider in particular the online art market, so concerning all periods, art objects, as well as contemporary digital art, we can consider further advantages, including visibility and simplicity of ownership, increase of the speed of capital circulation, and disintermediation. Next to the main advantages of blockchain, we have also some opportunities. We have also some main challenges. And these challenges include the fact that blockchain as such is a single source of information. It has a degree of flexibility of encrypted information that can be altered. Disintermediation as such reduces the role of legal and enforcement authorities versus a faster developing practice. And finally, a further commodification of art. I would like now to switch to a couple of case studies in order to talk about the practice of blockchain applied to the art market. I would like to start with Artory. Artory, which established a partnership with Christie's Auctioneers. Artory, funded in 2016, so a quite recent enterprise. And there is a very emblematic moment in time of this partnership, and it concerns a major sale, the Epworth collection, 2 years ago. So using blockchain next to the traditional form of auctions to sell this collection. And this partnership also gave life to the Artory Registry, which is a data set on artworks provenance verified by specialists, so the role of expertise is still there, and transcribed on public blockchains through cryptographic records. The Artory Registry allows the anonymity of collectors, and more recently, Artory is enlarging its data sets, especially with collaborations with major art and antique fairs like TEFAF, CADAF, and others. The main target of this platform are art market intermediaries, in fact. Now, let's switch to another case study. And I would like to speak about Verisart, established just 1 year before Artory. And this is a different business model that we are interested to look at. Verisart still ensures transparency, anonymity, and security about authorship and ownership. It is verifiable by anyone. It invests a lot on the quality of the images and the quality of records, and it is accessible from mobile devices. And another interesting aspect of this platform is its combination with of blockchain with other technologies like artificial intelligence and computer vision in order to expand the experience in dealing with blockchain. And it is a Bitcoin-based system, and it accompanies also a Bitcoin-based system for art transactions. The main target, similarly to Artory, are art market intermediaries. And finally, a third case study which is 4R Technologies, which is the relatively more recent platform, which has a particular feature of the so-called augmented authentication technology, which is quite based on the possibility to authenticate the physical image. That is, it is not only a matter of providing a digital certificate to support authenticity and provenance, but complements the certificate with the authentication of the physical image of the art object. Moreover, this platform allows the identification of market players, therefore further supporting the provenance contribution of blockchain. Similarly to Verisart, it is accessible from mobile devices, and differently from Verisart, instead of Bitcoin, it is based on Ethereum, so a similar system for art transactions. And 4R Technologies is also more oriented toward contemporary art. In fact, the main target is constituted by artists, and also in order to support the resales of these artists. So, to conclude, blockchain as a technology is an established technology, although its application on the art market is still emerging and far from full potential. It is considered as a possible viable solution in order to limit the threat of art forgeries and better secure the authenticity and provenance of artworks. It can substantially reduce instances of fraud by providing a transparent chain of custody for individual artwork. It does not require the involvement of a third party, as in the traditional art market, for transfers of value, while providing the parties involved in the transaction with high confidence in the security of the operation. Blockchain with smart contracts represent an opportunity for artists to protect their ownership rights from misuse and exploitations. And we have seen different business models of existing platform applying blockchain to the art market. And it is particularly interesting to consider this case study because as similarly to what I've seen in, for instance, crowdfunding for the arts and culture, so another application of new technologies to the financing in the arts and cultural field, where finance is pretty close to the art market, as we know. So the practice is anticipating the intervention of public policies in terms of legislation and enforcement of the legislation. So it is crucial to be deeply aware of these business models, how they work, their possible impact, in order to better support the development of regulation. So thank you, and here are my contact details for possible further discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor, for really broadening our horizons, considering technology and the possibilities that blockchain brings, and also challenges that blockchain brings to the field. And definitely in our tomorrow's afternoon discussion, we're going to touch also the issue of technology. Un tagad mēs no tehnoloģiju piedāvātajām.
And now we are moving from technologies towards maybe different types of changes in our sector. Namely, as the last speaker today, it is my honor now to give floor to Professor Manlio Frigjo, full professor of international law, Milan University. So he will talk about monitoring the trade in art, the importance of provenance and due diligence in trading in art and cultural property.
Here in this afternoon. Microphone, please. Up.
Sorry about that. Now I hope you're seeing and listening to me correctly.
Everything is wonderful, yes.
Okay, thank you so much, and congratulations for this very interesting seminar, and let me thank very warmly the organizers for inviting me to take part and to share some remarks about the issue of monitoring the trade in art and the importance of provenance and due diligence in trading in art and cultural property. And let's say that in a global art market where transparency is sometimes lacking, legal due diligence is really crucial for all transactions. And in fact, let me add that verifying the factual and legal circumstances which surround the transaction is as important as collecting and safeguarding the fundamental information of the good in question in order to avoid or at least reduce significantly any transactional risk in relation to a sale, a donation, a loan, or a deposit. Now, legal due diligence, I would say that it entails a multifaceted investigation, especially for cross-border transaction. And first, the authenticity and provenance of the artwork of culture or cultural property have to be checked. So author, date, type, historical period, materials used, all these things have to add up. Second, if I may sum up, second, the seller has to prove that he or she owns the artwork and that no specific liens, guarantees, or other constraints may prevent its free transfer. And this aspect becomes more complex when one considers that the differences, the well-known differences, I would say, between the civil and common law system, let me just explain that, as you probably are aware of, the civil law system hingers on possession as envisioned in the Napoleonic Code with the famous rule en fait de meuble, la possession vaut titre, and thus stolen goods may sometimes be lawfully transferred based on possession alone, whereas in common law system, like in the UK or the US, the legitimate owners of the artwork generally has superior title of ownership to a good faith purchaser, thus precluding lawful transfer of stolen goods. So the lawfulness of a given transaction depends entirely on the applicable law, which has to be checked out. Third, an artwork provenance and materials can also raise what we call the red flags. For example, if composed of banned or patented materials, the seller's identity is also a key consideration. Transactions with unknown counterparties or never-ending chains of intermediaries ought to be avoided, or a significantly higher or lower price than the market value for a particular type of artworks also raises a red flag, as do uncommon payment methods like the bitcoins that have been just mentioned, or blatant conflicts of interest, or particular situations of the seller, like kind of a marital separation, for instance. Now, in all these cases, a multidisciplinary team of experts can make the difference. Often, I would say that unwelcome surprises emerge when it's too late to do anything. And this is why the legal due diligence should be completed during the negotiations phase. And this regardless of whether it's a collector purchasing an artwork on the market, or an art dealer wanted to resell an artwork, or a museum being donated or loaned an artwork. But what skills are essential to a successful outcome of an artwork's purchase? often legal experts from different jurisdictions need to work side by side in a united team to ensure comprehensive legal due diligence. And working in sync is especially key given the complexity of the legal framework. For instance, national, civil, criminal, tax, and administrative law on the one hand, the international conventions concerning property circulation or smuggling, the EU regulations and directives on import, export, money laundering, and return of cultural goods. And last but not least, all these things have already been mentioned all along this morning presentations. I was saying last but not least, national and international codes of ethics, like those issued by, we heard, UNESCO, ICOM, Red List, CINOA, AAM, and now, second step, authenticity and provenance. It starts with the basic detailed checks on all the documentation and information that's combined with the assessment of the artwork's history and authorships provide a clear, or should provide a clear picture of the artwork's authenticity and provenance. So historical bibliographies, scientific studies, valuations and appraisals by independent accredited appraisers and art historians always prove useful. And there are, of course, international evaluation standards. We don't have much time to go in deep in this, but things are obviously much simpler if the artist or foundation to which an artwork belongs issues a certificate of authenticity, and even more so if the artwork is included in a catalogue raisonné. This is because it removes, of course, any doubts as to who the artist is, and foundations always keep archives documenting the ownership history of their artworks. Even if I have to add here that, as it is well known, some important artist foundations ceased to provide authentication, and which is the case of Fontana Foundation or Rothko foundations, among others. As to the value or an artwork, the collection of reference plays a key role, and as auction records show, artworks from renowned collections attract much higher bids. Lastly, red flags and unlawful dealings, for instance, stolen or misappropriated artworks, can also be identified from public and private databases, like the Interpol Stolen Works of Art databases or the Italian Carabinieri databases for stolen cultural property, and private databases like the one of the Art Loss Register. But naturally, a red flag should be raised whenever an artwork lacks a certificate of authenticity or has undergone restoration when there ought to have been none, or has an unclear provenance, or is it by an artist whose work is known to be frequent target of forgery, like is the case of the Chirico, for instance, who was a forger himself, I would say a serial forger of his own artworks. So knowledge, or at least an approximate acknowledgement of the legal framework of reference is also vital. A few regulatory instruments that have been mentioned this morning come into play at the European Union level, like the Council regulation on export of cultural goods, the directive on the return of cultural objects unlawfully removed from the territory of a member state, and the recent regulation on the introduction and import of cultural goods. And also, of course, one should give an eye to the applicable rules in the country, in the domestic law of the country of provenance, that certainly should need to be checked out. Because as we know, certain countries, most countries or many countries provide for administrative and criminal provisions in case of what is called illicit export. Now, the provenance and nature of the cultural goods plays, of course, another important role. The goal of the legal due diligence here will vary on a case-by-case basis, but let me just provide you a couple of examples. First of all, it is important to prevent the acquisition of archaeological or ethnological objects obtained from unlawful excavations or that come from certain areas of the world. The typical example nowadays is objects coming from Iraq and Syria or Afghanistan, because as we all know, these are subject to a number of UN, United Nations Security Council resolution, as well as European Union regulations that prevent the imports of certain goods coming from those areas of the world for very notorious reasons. Another issue is to assess whether constraints or bans on trade or export of certain categories of goods are imposed by the country of provenance. Typically is the case of ivory or human remains, that we all know that there's been interesting cases of the request for restitution of human remains. Also, another issue is concerned the historical period that so systematic looting and should be a particular cause of concern, one for all. 1933, 1946, 48 in Europe. I'm referring to, of course, Nazi looted art, which is made the object, as should be very well known, of the famous Washington Conference principles on Nazi confiscated art adopted in 1999 by this intergovernmental conference that saw governments officials of some 44 countries meet to discuss how to solve issues relating to artworks confiscated in Nazi-occupied territories between 1933 and 1945 and never returned. These principles that were reaffirmed in the Conference of Vilnius in 2000 and of Terezin in 2009, as we know, are not binding. But it's kind of much more moral engagements taken by governments, even though some countries did, interestingly, implement the Washington Principle and adopted national domestic legislations which adopts the same principle, which is the case, among the others, of France or of the Netherlands or Austria or Germany. At the US, as it is also well known, in 2016 passed the Holocaust Expropriated Art Recovery Act. Can you hear me? I hear an echo. Okay, go on. To provide the victims of Holocaust era prosecution and their heirs a fair opportunity to recover art was confiscated. But even before, I have to say that there were cases, I mean, even before the adoption of this law in the statute in the United States, we had cases of jurisprudence, of US jurisprudence in 2014, for instance, providing for the restitution of artworks confiscated, reasoning that the federal policy also includes the Washington Conference principle on Nazi confiscated art. It is an opinion of a court, but it is an important one. Title of ownership. The legal due diligence can entail investigating the validity of the possessor's title of ownership of an artwork, and this is especially advisable when the seller is not the artist. And in this case, the due diligence entails, among other things, the analysis of sales invoices and other administrative documentation, the verification of the existence of a will or other documentation providing rightful heirship or of deeds of donation, and checks as to whether the artwork is encumbered by a pledge or other guarantees. And naturally, it goes without saying, this investigation into legal ownership necessarily entails the ascertaining the law applicable to the transaction, because as mentioned before, civil law and common law differ in this regard. So an investigation based on one or the other can lead to very different outcomes. And let's come to international circulation here very, very quickly, but let me just mention that one of the reasons why we are here today is to celebrate the 1970 UNESCO Convention and the 1995 UNIDROIT Conventions, which are both very, very important in order to ensure a more transparency in the art market. And let me add that in this case, also the European Union Directive 2014-60 is important, because we probably all know that Article 10 of the directive is basically identical to the famous Article 4, paragraph 4 of the UNIDROIT Convention, which deals with due diligence, which becomes so very, very quintessential also in this case. And criminal liability. Let me add that I'm almost ending my presentation, but let me end with this issue. Criminal liability has been said before by Dana Yates also, for partial or total failure to exercise due diligence. I hear an echo.
Everything is okay. We hear you
okay,
good.
Okay,
Yeah.
Sorry about that. So an in-depth legal due diligence on authenticity, provenance, ownership, and import-export status avoids the risk of criminal liability and penalties. In other words, a purchaser has to gather sufficient information in order to be able to write out that a given cultural good has not been the subject of a criminal offense, such as receipt of stolen goods, forgery, unlawful export, or unlawful excavation. And when international circulation is involved, failure to comply with export regulations can result in seizure and confiscation in some cases if the purchaser is aware that the cultural good was unlawfully exported, or should have been aware of this circumstance had the proper due diligence been exercised. There are also tax aspects. I won't spend much time on this issue, but also comprehensive due diligence is a multifaceted process, and indeed it sometimes extends beyond the legal aspects of cultural good or artwork circulation, which is typically the case when tax aspects are involved, like when a trust, which is something that happens quite frequently, a trust fund with artworks is dissolved and the works are distributed among the beneficiaries. And due diligence in this case should focus on the proper application of like succession or donation taxes, so direct taxes, and VAT, for instance, which is an indirect tax. Some speakers before mentioned the importance of responsible art markets guideline. And let me add that the increasing complexity in this respect of the art market has promoted many efforts to provide the market appropriate tools to exercise due diligence before purchasing cultural goods. And this is a notable example of responsible art market, RAM, which has been explained as has been explained before, is a non-profit based in Geneva that has spearheaded an initiative to keep market operators up to speed on the associated risk. So I won't spend more words because Alessandro Checchi already said something about this. But to summarize and to say that the end goal, in order to facilitate a successful transactions, the preliminary checks and assessments I've touched on are an inextricable part of this very concept of due diligence and an invaluable means of averting the risk associated with art and cultural property transactions. So legal due diligence is a part and parcel of this increasingly recommended standard under the codes of ethics in the field, and even sometimes obligatory under national, European Union, and international regulation. So really the final word, legal due diligence is truly the embodiment of the old adage, better safe than sorry. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor, and thank you for extremely valuable insight in the law perspective and international law perspective. It's definitely going to serve as the ground for tomorrow's discussion in the afternoon session. Thank you very much indeed. Paldies, runāja Prof.
Thank you once again, Professor Maligno Frigio from the University Milano, the international law professor who gave us an insight into the international law and regulatory frameworks and gave us some food for thought before we discuss these issues tomorrow afternoon. Before we end today's session, we have a UNESCO video to give a bit of an emotional impetus and visualization of the importance of this topic, how to preserve culture by combating illicit trade.
It's a strange little object, isn't it? That bell-shaped body, those big wide eyes. Looks like something you might pick up at your local market, right? But there's a much bigger story here. This little object is called the Eye Idol. It is 5,000 years old and was discovered in Syria. It's an irreplaceable part of the country's cultural heritage. Sadly, the Eye Idols are only one example of many objects at risk of disappearing completely. While the conflict in the country rages on, the theft of ancient artifacts during illegal excavations becomes easier, and they can be small enough to fit in a piece of hand luggage. Since 2011, 25% of Syria's archaeological sites have been pillaged. Once stolen, they're smuggled into neighboring countries. Despite these countries' best efforts to fight illegal trafficking, stolen artifacts eventually end up on the antiques market. The increased sale of these artifacts online makes it hard to keep track of them. The good news is, you can help stop this. Before purchasing an antique object, keep an eye out for these red flags. Is there dirt on it? Does it seem like a broken fragment of a larger artifact? Is there a reference number painted on its base that looks like it's from a museum? Does its price seem too good to be true? And most importantly, can the seller provide you with the object's provenance paperwork? If you feel suspicious about the object, you should alert the police, customs, museums and culture ministries, or UNESCO. Syria is home to some of humanity's oldest and most valuable cultural wonders. The looting of artifacts threatens the country's rich cultural identity. Help us put an end to this illicit trafficking. For more information on this, please visit this link and the web pages of UNESCO's main partners, aiding in the fight against illicit trafficking of cultural property.
Un ar šādu skaistu vizuālu.
So, ladies and gentlemen, this wonderful visualization concludes the first day of this two-day conference, a day that was focused on sort of wider context and some parts of various sections and elements. We're going to continue in the same manner right here at 11 o'clock, same time. We'll be joined by law enforcement experts and market players, those who know the market perspective, who are dealing with these issues on a daily basis. So we'll have quite an interesting discussion in the afternoon tomorrow. We will have quite interesting panelists and many of the speakers from today's session as well taking part in tomorrow's discussion. Would like to once again remind you that the presentations will be available to you as participants of the conference after the conference. And this day was as a stepping stone for tomorrow, which will focus on practices in Latvia. Thank you very much. This concludes our today's session. See you tomorrow, 11 o'clock sharp. Thank you.